Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Suzanne Modell, and I chair the committee that plans these broadcasts. Today's program is showing in March, which is Women's History Month. Concerned Citizens has traditionally devoted its March programming to the challenges women face at home, at work, and in their communities. One of the least emphasized and most harmful of these challenges is domestic violence. In the United States, across intimate relationships of all kinds, approximately 1 in 5 partners has experienced physical violence at the hands of the other partner. 85% of domestic violence victims are women. Among those female homicides that have been solved, 6 of every 10 victims was murdered by her partner. In ordinary times, domestic violence is a serious problem. In extraordinary times, such as when a pandemic forces everyone to stay at home, domestic violence is a gargantuan problem. Consequently, as we mark the 1-year anniversary of staying at home, Concerned Citizens is devoting its first Women's History Month of 2021 program to domestic violence. We have 2 articulate, knowledgeable experts to enlighten us about this disturbing subject: Vivian Klesak and Jane Stover. So now I turn the program over to Vivian.
Today is a conversation about the issue of domestic violence sponsored by the Concerned Citizens. My name is Vivian Klesak. I am a member of Concerned Citizens, and I am the founding director of Human Options Alternatives for Abused Women and Their Families. Almost 40 years ago when we started, domestic violence was very much hidden, even though the first shelters had opened. And sadly, it is still somewhat hidden even today. So today, we're going to hopefully break up some of the myths and stereotypes and raise some of the important issues. With me today is Professor Jane Stover, who is the director of the Family Violence Clinic at UCLA School of Law. And I'll let Jane talk a little bit about herself.
Well, Vivian, thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you today. You are an inspiration to me in terms of all that you have created, all of you that you've done for our community and for the broader movements against gender-based violence. So my name is Jane Stover. I'm a professor at UC Irvine School of Law, where I direct our domestic violence clinic, which we represent clients in a wide range of legal cases, from domestic violence restraining orders, custody, immigration issues, and always looking for policy interventions and changes that need to be made. I also direct the UCI initiative to end family violence. And that combines faculty members from 21 different departments across the university with community partners like Human Options that Vivian co-founded, and in working on different research, education, and clinical interventions in abuse across the lifespan. Also here in Orange County, I co-chair our domestic violence death review team and have done a lot of work over the years in terms of scholarship, and this is really an area of passion and deep concern. So thank you for the invitation today.
I want to go back a little bit in history because I'm not sure how familiar the people who are part of Concerned Citizens are with domestic violence, even though concerned citizens are very socially active in many good progressive causes. And that is because domestic violence is hidden. The victims are embarrassed, the perpetrators are embarrassed, and nobody, quote, looks like a perpetrator. And every now and then when there is a public awareness, people are shocked. He looks just like my husband. She looks just like me. And what we want to do is shine a light on a problem that used to be hidden totally. It is a social problem. It is a personal problem. It is a criminal issue. And it is primarily a major social issue involving housing, employment, racial and class issues, and the whole issue of women's role in society. Jane said it is gender-based, and I think that's really important. Do you want to talk a little bit about the gender-based part of domestic family violence?
Yeah, well, and when with your mention of taking a historical perspective, and we don't want to spend too long back in history, because if we look back at our nation's history, the law was such that as long as a man didn't kill or maim his wife, he couldn't be prosecuted. And so thinking about a woman as property and the property of her father and then her husband, this was entirely a gendered construct. And then our early laws, which started in the 1970s, it wasn't until 1993 that each state even had a law against domestic violence. And so, and those early laws talked about wife abuse. And what we now know, of course, is that abuse can happen in any kind of relationship at the same rates within LGBTQ relationships. We think about the broad statistics of 1 in 4 women being abused in her lifetime, 1 in 7 men. And so it is still something that often is so gender-based, but we want to think broadly. On that point of just how many people it affects, we are now aware of, the commonality in terms of those statistics, that injury through domestic violence occurs more often to women than the combined number of automobile accidents, stranger rapes, and muggings. And I think of how often I say to my mom, to my sister, like, be careful, text me when you get home.
Yeah.
And we don't say enough to each other, how are you doing in your relationship? And in terms of thinking about, is there safety in the home? And of course, right now we're talking to each other over Zoom because we're in the midst of a global pandemic. And we think about pandemics within pandemics because the rates of domestic violence, of gender-based abuse was already occurring at pandemic levels, according to the World Health Organization. And our nation, as we think about the Black Lives Matter movement and our 400 plus year struggle with anti-Black racism, that this is another pandemic, and then our global health pandemic that's exacerbating the issues of inequality and of violence within the home.
So what we're talking about today is something that could be affecting your family member, your neighbor. It is not confined to people that, quote, look different than us. Part of what we've done in terms of community education throughout the last 39 years for Human Options is share the stories. It can be an older woman, often people who have an issue of Alzheimer's. A wonderful partner might become violent, or a new partner, somebody you meet who sounds very exciting, might be an abuser. You don't know. It's one of the funny lines from a talk that I heard is that you could date Jack the Ripper for 2 months and you wouldn't know. The propensity to violence, the control issues emerge. I was very happy that my 18-year-old grandson just took the training to be a volunteer at Human Options, and he came away with that saying, it's not about drugs or alcohol, it's about the need for power and control. Mm-hmm. And that is why it tends to be more likely that a woman would be severely injured or victimized over time in very crucial, dramatic ways. Though men are victims, it's a different kind of victimization. The toxic masculinity that we now see in our culture is one of the causes of people becoming perpetrators. Mm-hmm. What do you see, Jane, in the domestic violence cases that you're dealing with for the court now with you and your students?
Yeah, well, and there's such a variety, and Vivian, I appreciate that you touch on just all that this can look like. And so we see these underlying dynamics of power and control, but this takes a lot of different forms within different people's experiences. And so we can think about economic abuse and control, thinking about physical violence and sexual violence, which so often it's hard for people to recognize within intimate relationships. And so we have a societal conception of stranger rape. And I had a case a little while ago, and this was all on the record, and I won't give any identifying information of clients, but a client of mine was giving testimony to the judge and was explaining forced sex. And the judge, it was a female judge, she stopped and interrupted her and said, "Are you talking about rape?" And my client hesitated and she said, "Well, I guess, but it happens so often." So she had not labeled it that. And so to think about, for somebody to come to something that's labeled a domestic violence clinic, they have to actually identify their experience as fitting into that. And that's a really complicated thing when there's somebody that you trust, that you have children with, that you love, who is also someone who hurts you. And so recognizing just the deep complexities here. So what we see is a huge range. I've done a lot of work on HIV-related intimate partner violence. Had a client whose boyfriend flushed her HIV medication down the toilet, saying, "You're going to die anyways." And that was what caused her to seek help, not any of the prior physical abuse. But our laws, when we're, these relatively recent laws on domestic violence didn't include things like medical interference within our statutes. And so thinking about what the law says on its face, but then what we see within people's experiences. And so how might someone exercise control? We're in the midst of election season, and I was contacted by a reporter last week to ask about interference with voting. And so you can think about issues of, do you have the freedom and the autonomy to be able to participate in the democratic process, to be able to go to different political clubs, to be able to fill out your own ballot? And so looking at all of these different ways where it can mean a punch or attempted strangulation, but it can also mean interference with your medical care, with your self-esteem and self-worth. And so this is all to say we see a huge range, and it's really important to be able to really approach each person as an individual and to hear what their concerns are, what their goals are. Not everybody's goal is leaving, but their goal might be safety and navigating a relationship in a different way. And then we can think about the court context right now in the context of COVID and how we're doing a lot more hearings remotely through technology. And so being able to still get that access to the legal remedies, even in the midst of the health concerns that we have. All of those remedies regarding domestic violence and emergency issues have remained available. So there might be a feeling that the courts are closed, but they have not been closed to these issues and concerns. And Vivian, I'm sure you have so many insights from your years of working with domestic abuse survivors in terms of just how we think about what domestic violence is.
Well, everything you're saying fits totally. It's a complicated problem. In our culture, women are supposed to be the carriers of the relationship, the feelings. The women are the ones who are at home, making things a lovely home. But in truth, women and men are both responsible for the relationship. And we're asked again and again the same questions. Well, why is she with him? And that is because you don't meet a batter, you meet a whole human being, and you will not discover that the person is abusive or physically or in any of the other ways that Jane described until there's some kind of a stressful situation. And then, like most couples, you'll try to minimize it. You'll both be embarrassed. And so you make it go away. You don't talk about it. That's what we call the tension building phase. And then something blows up and a bad thing happens. And then you don't talk about it. And you have what we call the honeymoon phase, where the guy is, and I'm saying the guy because most perpetrators are male. That doesn't mean it couldn't happen the other way. The person who has done the abuse is sorry, and there's a very lovely phase. Over time, the honeymoon phase gets smaller and smaller. So then we're asked, well, does she stay with him? Why doesn't she leave? And I think as Jane began to explain to you, it's not that simple to leave a relationship, especially if there are economic ties, if there are children together, if you don't know where else you'd live. It's a big, huge step. And anybody who takes that step is very brave, People say, well, battered women must be weak. They must be masochistic. No, they're probably just people who work really hard to keep their relationship strong. Coming to a shelter is the change that can change a total life, because there's not only safety, but there is counseling, support, peer support, opportunities for job hunting, for decent affordable housing, legal assistance through the UCI program, and some volunteer attorneys. There is a total helping. So just leaving is throwing yourself into this open air with no sense of how you land. We're proud to partner with many, many organizations. One of the things that's become more and more difficult is the cyberbullying, and we see this especially with teenagers. A lot of our work now is about prevention. If we can teach kids healthy ways of being in relationship, get rid of the passivity that has been the traditional female role, get rid of male needs for control and power, we can help build a new culture. And meanwhile, we have day-to-day many, many cases. When you see people referred by the shelter, how do you partner together?
Well, and none of us does this work alone. And I don't give a single community presentation without also talking about our state-funded domestic violence agencies that we have here in Orange County of Human Options, Laura's House, WTLC, and Interval House. And it is just so important that people be able to have the counseling and safety planning services, housing needs, and this kind of long-term case management and being able to really create this beautiful future. And so the legal remedy, we know the law has not solved the problem of domestic violence. And I think it's really important to be really real about what the limitations of any of our current solutions have been. And so we partner in terms of accepting referrals from so many of the agencies, and also then of seeing what needs do our clients have, how do they sustain an end to violence. It's not simply with a court order. That is hugely important, and our civil domestic violence restraining orders are the most effective legal remedy that we have, and dramatically decrease at least police reported violence. And 9 out of 10, like in these national studies, 90% of people who seek a civil domestic violence restraining order say they would do it again, which is remarkable given that it's an adversarial system. And so we do see safety impacts from that, but we have to think about what are the material differences and what are the psychological supports to actually make that happen. And so whether clients are reaching out to my office directly, from the start, we normalize the value of counseling, and counseling both for an abuse survivor and for children who do see and hear and feel so much, and who need to be supported in their own process of overcoming trauma and surviving trauma. And so I think, strong ways in terms of both receiving referrals, also being really thoughtful about what the attorney-client relationship is and having that remain a confidential relationship. So we're very careful about some of those different boundaries, but also bringing in community supports and realizing that none of us can be everything to everyone. And we need to figure out who in the community we can partner with.
It takes a village. I first became involved in this issue when I was running the Orange County Department of Mental Health South County office in Laguna Beach in 1977. And we set up a task force to educate our mental health advisory board members. But who got educated? All of our team too. And for me and 2 members of the mental health advisory board, our president and vice president, we became passionate about this, the issue that in a place where people should be safest at home, where a family, a woman and her children should be safest at home, they're most afraid. And we were touched by so many stories of the mom saying, okay, kids, go to your room and be quiet because daddy's coming home, instead of daddy's coming home. The issue is so strong because domestic violence is child abuse. And one of the complicated issues sometimes is that the woman may be the victim, but she stayed in the family, and she could possibly be inappropriately charged with child abuse because she's, quote, allowed it to happen. And that's a complicated situation that we saw sadly more than once. And how do you deal with that when that comes to you legally, Jane.
Yeah. And so, we also think societally about the pressures to maintain a family unit. And so I want to, you identified before, this is a medical, this is a societal, this is a legal issue. Thinking about what are our societal pressures to stay together versus being able to find freedom from violence. And so often children are the reason that clients stay in relationships, and they say, I stayed because I wanted to give my child that other parent and to keep our family unit together. And there's the religious and familial pressures. And then children are also the reason that clients leave. And so I have a client who the opposing party, the father of her children, was literally telling the children to hit her, to punch her. And she said, oh my gosh, he's turning them into batterers. And that was what actually prompted her to go into emergency shelter and then referred to our clinic from there. And so thinking about our broader societal pressures is really important in terms of then understanding where the law can intervene. Here in California, we still do have failure to protect laws, which I would have expected would have gone away about 2 decades ago with the Nicholson case out of New York, that shed light on how the fact that these laws which say that exposing a child to domestic abuse is the victimized parent's failure to protect them from violence. And so that's what Vivian's referring to, those failure to protect laws. But really what we see is that survivors are so actively surviving abuse. Yeah. And is why I call people survivors, because it's remarkable the really creative, persistent things people have done to survive abuse and to be able to protect their children through that process too. And so what we do is really highlighting all that the client both has endured, but then the actions that client is taking to appropriately protect the children and to have safety. And so some of that might be through getting a civil restraining order and going through a PEP class, the 10-week class that Human Options and the other agencies all run. And those classes are so valuable. The personal empowerment program, my clients talk about how, the fact of being able to, whether it be physically in a room together or over Zoom now, in a room, and hear other people who they relate to. They say, are you talking about my same experience? How was it that you saw inside my home? To be able to take off some of that blame and sense of responsibility for the abuse, and to be able to really build up their own sense of empowerment to move forward. So the failure to protect issues have been really problematic because they've so often been enforced along racial and class lines. And that's what the class action out of New York really showed, that there was very different treatment of women of color, and their children were being systematically removed from them and their parental rights terminated. And so these are areas that I think that we still need to keep working on and questioning and critiquing and changing.
And economic issues are also really important. I have 2 stories from 2 ends of the economic structure. I spoke with a graduate, a very successful graduate of Human Options, to the matrimonial lawyers of California. And she was from an affluent husband and wife situation, but she had little control over the money. And one of the attorneys said, well, you had money. Couldn't you save money? How come you didn't leave earlier? She said, well, I could not get an attorney to talk to me without a $25,000 retainer. And then my grandmother died and left me $25,000. And the next day I was at an attorney's office. So I think that was a self-realization for the attorneys that we might be part of the problem. And then the other end is that they're totally dependent for a small economic life on the perpetrator. And we found this is especially true the older the family is, because maybe it's not so true in 2020. So this was a case that happened in about 2000. A younger woman had come from Oregon to her mom and to see that her mother was being abused by her dad, and she convinced her mom to come to the shelter. And during the time in the shelter, she got a referral for legal assistance. And she said, I'd like to leave. I want to go live next to my daughter in Oregon, but I don't have any money. My husband owns the house. And the attorney said, well, no, actually not. In California, everything is community property, and you and your husband own the house. She had been married 50 years. She had been a very traditional person, and she didn't know her rights. So over time, the house was sold, and she moved to Oregon and bought a small place with her proceeds. So part of what we don't understand is we don't always know the laws, and the victims don't always know the laws either. So education, we start in high schools now. We actually start in middle schools talking about what's healthy dating behavior. And no, he doesn't have a right to tell you you can't talk to other boys. And what's the first sign of abuse? Well, it's that slowly isolating you from family and friends. And that happens with teens and it happens with families. Over the years, we've seen many sisters and brothers and mothers call and say, my daughter won't talk to me anymore. Her husband says I'm a bad influence. So it's so complicated that we need to pay attention to. I need to walk in somebody's shoes before I can even begin to understand why she hasn't left.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And we still have a gendered wage gap. And so, you commented that maybe this was a thing in the past, but no, we still have a gendered wage gap. And we still see also now in the midst of COVID, a story earlier this week in the New York Times talking about so many more women having to leave the workforce.
Right.
As we're all working from home, living from work, and schooling, and doing it all right now from home, and making hard decisions about that are often based on who has the greater income within a household. And so thinking about how our structural systems then further this. So the statistics are that in 99% of cases where there's physical abuse, there's also economic abuse and control. And so we absolutely see this everywhere. And it's so important for attorneys to play a role in that broader community education about making legal rights and information about what your rights and remedies are available to the public. So we teach our students, this is a role that you have as an attorney, is also communicating this to the broader public. And we've had really amazing experiences also doing the education in our high schools and middle schools with the popularization of the Me Too movement that started back, became popularized in October 2017. I was invited to give a talk at University High. And as I was setting up, a young man approached me saying, I see these statistics and I don't want to be them. And that struck me that, here we were having these voluntary audiences that were equally male and female, which was not the case with the sessions I would do 5-10 years ago. But people seeing like, I don't want to be on either side of these cases. And how can we change this? Because with the Me Too movement, within 24 hours, over half of people who were on Facebook personally knew someone who had said Me Too. Mm-hmm. That's a lot harder to ignore than just a general statistic on a billboard. When you have someone who's in your personal life, in your family and friend network saying that. So I do, you know that I am a forever hopeful person, but I actually do see a lot of positive change and possibility here, and openings to conversations that we hadn't had in the past.
And we do not mean to demonize one gender over the other, but I think it is true that because of the power and control, the whole history of our country, because of masculine issues and toxic masculinity, we generally see more consistent and severe abuse male to female. However, we have become much more open to looking at how is the man abused, how is the boy abused, how is he or she controlled. And one of the things the shelters do now is have space for men. The homicides in domestic violence have been reduced in part because of all these wonderful interventions. And one of the things that's greatly reduced is the victim shooting the batterer, because she has a place to go. She has safety. She has hope. One of the things in my work with a variety of groups in the social service sector, one of the things we've seen is that the reduction of pregnancy among teenage girls in the Hispanic community, and they have hope. They have all kinds of wonderful groups that work with them, that help them build a vision of a new life. And that is what we need to give people who are victims of violence and even perpetrators, that they have hope, that they can change. And in order to do that, we need to break down the wall of silence that nobody talks about it. And, we like to brag. I was at a luncheon the other day and everybody's bragging about their kids. Well, how are you going to go tell your mother or your father, well, this wonderful man that I married and this wonderful wedding that you paid for, it's not working out so well. He's an abuser. He hits me. So often the family is the last to know because the shame, this is supposed to be the perfect marriage. The shame is incredible. And by doing all these community education efforts and having the groups like PEP in the community, we show people that it can happen to a nice person, a person who's poor or rich, a good person, and it's not about something horrible wrong with you.
Absolutely. And we think about the stressors that so many families are under right now during COVID, the enormous economic stressors. And so we think about the enormous economic stressors and the heightened use of alcohol and other substances, of firearms in the home. And so all of these compounded dangers also, and the importance of really taking a public health approach to these issues. And so what if we thought about all of these issues also through a public health lens, including issues of firearms in the home? And I think about what we did during the 80s and 90s with the Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And now over 2/3 of Americans report that they have actually stopped a friend from driving while intoxicated. And so thinking about firearms, and you may not always have something that rises to the level of having a court order, but during what we know are very stressful times for a family, during job loss, during divorce or custody battles, this is a good time for someone else to hold your guns. This is a good time for someone to be checking in on someone. And so the ways that our courts and our services could actually help promote that kind of community care for each other could go a long way. And so I encourage us to both think about where the legal solutions are, then also these kind of more community-based and public health solutions.
That's so important. If you have a friend who seems withdrawn, who you haven't talked to her or her husband for a while, calling and saying, how are you doing? Are you okay? Want to take a walk? Being reached to. I still get wonderful moments where I'm in the community. I was at an Albertsons and a woman was doing one of those demonstrations of selling vodka, and she stepped out of her cube and she came running up to me and said, Vivian, you saved my life. Well, Vivian didn't save her life. Human Options, the counselors, the case managers, the hotline worker, the legal advocate, her personal therapist, we all saved her life together. And she saved her life because she stepped forward. She sought help and then she acted. So we all saved her life together. But that is an incredible experience that only happens when the woman has some way of breaking out of isolation. So much of what we're doing now is education and prevention. We have red flag laws in California that came after a horrific murders of Santa Barbara students by a very disturbed young man. And his parents had gone to the police to ask his guns be taken away. But that was before the red flag laws. Now you can go, if you are concerned about anybody in your family, you can go to the police and make a request and they will evaluate it. These laws are very rarely used, partially because it takes a long time to become familiar, but also because people don't want to make a fuss, make a big deal, step forward. But you could save not one life, but many lives, including the lives of the person who has the gun. We are in a stage now where we're looking at the role of the criminal system in domestic violence. In 1984, when we saw the video of the police officer who stood while a woman was being abused because it was on private property, and then we began getting laws saying it is against the law to abuse your spouse. We thought this was great. This was a new beginning, but it was only a piece of the puzzle. Sometimes arresting the perpetrator is very, very necessary, and especially if the police have been trained by domestic violence programs in what's called the primary aggressor, where just because she put a scratch on his face doesn't mean she should be arrested, because if you do the interview, you will find out that she has been terrorized for years. So when there's a good partnership between the police and the community, it works. Unfortunately, often the person most likely to be arrested is the person of color or of poverty. And so that's something we have to address, because incarceration is not the answer. It is a piece of the puzzle. And if there's severe and prolonged abuse, sometimes that has to happen. But in other cases, we need what Jane and I are calling the community, the family, the village. And of course, our village has our own community services program, and Human Options has a senior counselor who connects with the Laguna Village entire social services department, so that if there's anybody they're concerned about, she can go out and make a home visit also.
Yeah, and it's so important for us to think about all of the different, like what we want from those first responder responses. And we know that, I mentioned before, law hasn't solved the problem of domestic violence, and certainly the criminal legal system has not. And we see so often the ways in which survivors are criminalized. And that is of deep concern, both the ways in which having a jail sentence can affect an entire family, but also the very surprisingly high rate at which our clients who are seeking help from the police, including seeking help enforcing a permanent restraining order, are themselves arrested. And so often this is happening along the lines of it being a woman of color, somebody who lacks secure immigration status. And so the idea that you can call the police and get a predictable response, it's that might be something that folks with more privilege can have, and we want that to be true of everyone. And so that's something that we struggle with in our clinic, of our clients who have sought police help but are then finding themselves as defendants in cases, whether it's, I'll give one example so that this is concrete, a client who filed for child support against her abusive ex-boyfriend with whom she had a child. And he sent about 200 text messages containing many threats, came and was pounding down the door to the apartment she was staying in. It was her sister's apartment. And he succeeded in pushing in the door. She was pushing back against the door and scratched him in the process. She called 911 for help. So here the police come to the scene. There are witnesses. There is a child who's been hurt from this door falling in. There are hundreds of text messages, including the threats, and a broken down door, right? But she is arrested because there's a visible mark on him. We were able to approach the DA's office and bring forth this history of abuse and all of this evidence of innocence. But this was a very, very frightening thing for this client, who still has this arrest on her record and lacked secure immigration status, whose sister called my office saying, my sister's been arrested for felony domestic violence and is going to be deported. Can you help? And that's not the experience that somebody who's victimized expects to have. And so being able to really do very thorough investigation on the scene is so important, and to think about what kind of responders and responses do we need to have. So there's a lot of work that our movements still need to do as we think about then the racial justice movement, economic justice movements, gender-based violence movements actually partnering together, and what that would look like.
There is a movement within the community of restorative justice, and that involves meeting with the perpetrator and the victim and a facilitator, and having the perpetrator take responsibility for the behavior. And I think in an intimate partner situation, that requires a great deal of work, of counseling, of support to get there, because the perpetrator, the person who has committed the violence, who is a boyfriend or a member, a husband, or in the family, is shamed, and so tends to do a lot of projection. This wouldn't have happened if you hadn't done da da da. And so restorative justice requires that we deal with the issue of shame, huge issue. as a long-term psychotherapist, I have seen many, many people in individual and couple counseling and realized that one of the ways that people hide shame is by projection and pushing out at the other person. And to take responsibility for your own behavior and not be shamed by others is crucial. So that's one of the things we try to teach children. I can remember when my little ones were 5 or 6 years old and something happened with the sibling, it would always be, it's her fault, she did it, it's her fault, when it might not have been her fault, but to protect self from shame, the earliest feeling is projection. And then for many, many women in our culture, introjection. We take responsibility. We don't want anybody to be upset. I've been amazed by seeing many accomplished, successful women who come to a meeting and their person they're meeting is about 5 minutes late. And when the person arrives 5 minutes late, the person who was on time often says, oh, I must have had the time wrong, because we make nice, we introject. So the work of restorative justice for intimate partner violence will require a lot of pre-conversations to help reduce that terrible feeling of shame and reframe projection to assertive responsibility. And I hope we can see some pilot projects of this in our own community.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about the way that our legal system is set up, our civil and criminal legal systems are set up to really encourage denial.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
you know, in terms of it, and it's very effective to deny your own behaviors as the defendant or respondent, rather than to try to identify the root causes and the compound trauma that someone has experienced to then be, you know, so often somebody who's utilizing violence in a relationship has experienced some pretty significant abuse or traumas of their own. And so the way that our legal system is really set up is, you know, like I mentioned, to really encourage and promote denial and refusing to accept responsibility unless you're ordered into a batter's intervention program, which then you're required to accept responsibility, at least superficially. So if we actually want to get to the root of these problems, Vivian, I'm saying exactly, I want to echo what you said of the need to be able to think a lot more creatively. And it does take a lot of work, a lot of commitment, a lot of really careful work around these issues, and thinking about how do we actually create these within our communities. We've had Mimi Kim speak multiple times at UCI through the Initiative to End Family Violence, who has been at the forefront of creating then restorative justice and transformative justice opportunities for abuse survivors. But what we know is that, you know, people know the number to call for the police. They know that there are courts, but our governmental systems have not funded restorative justice or transformative justice in the same kind of way. And so if somebody comes to me and says, I want to do this, well, do I know where to send them? And part of that is because it is so community-based that we may not know all that's happening. And there are informal ways in which this might be occurring. But thinking about what if we really tried to dedicate resources to that? There's got a couple books here with me. So one is The Politicization of Safety, that I edited this volume, that has chapters both from Mimi Kim and Donna Coker talking about restorative justice for college campuses. Because so often our Title IX responses and the kind of ways haven't really solved the issue. And then another book that I'm reading right now is Beyond Survival, that actually talks about survivors' experiences with restorative justice, strategies and stories from the transformative justice movement, and talking about how this can be messy, complex, hard work. And you know, there's nothing kind of simple, straightforward about what we're talking about today. We're talking about deeply complex issues, and it's work worth doing in terms of like really getting into tackling the hardest areas of this, I think.
That we understand that many, many people who are abusers were victims of trauma. There is a study out in the past several years, the diverse experiences of childhood these various experiences that will cause a child to lack certain emotional intelligence, to fail in certain ways in life. And one of the big ones is domestic violence. And I can remember we were making a video about our program, and we had a picture of a little boy. We didn't have a real little boy there because we didn't want to traumatize him, but we had a picture of a little boy. And one of the men who had been through our batterers treatment program and was living a new life with a new sense of health, emotional and physical health, he looked like a kind of a young Tom Hanks. And he started to talk, and the tears were coming down his eyes. And he said, I was that little boy. My stepfather used to take a big piece of wood and smack me across the back. And I wanted to never become that person. But he had no special education. He had no counseling. And when he became angry, he went back to what he knew, what the powerful person does. The person with power uses it and smacks somebody. So he, through our program and through his commitment to do it differently, because he wanted to stay in his marriage, he was a model of a new way of being. It takes a lot of time, effort, work on the part of the person, on the part of the counselor, on the part of the family member who has been abused, because learning to trust after violence is very hard. It's hard to imagine. When I used to do a lot of public speaking, I used to ask people to imagine that the person you love, then you know he's upset and you know he's stressed, and one day he just smacks you. That is impossible to imagine, and that is imprinted. That's the kind of trauma that doesn't go away. And if it happens on a periodic way, you will become distant and frightened, not just of that person, but of any new intimate relationship. So trauma impacts us in our minds, in our emotions, in our bodies. And most of the people who are violent, or at least many of them, I can't say that, many of them have had some key traumatic experience as a child.
It's so true. And so we're talking about what services we have for victim survivors, but so important to actually address the needs that somebody utilizing abuse has in terms of how do you actually change this? Jailing someone does not teach these skills that you're talking about, and normalizing this in terms of being able to actually get help earlier before it's just court ordered. And so thinking about what if we did focus on more teaching relationship skills earlier on, and problem solving skills, and how to have healthy conflicts, and how to decrease your own anxiety. We have some wonderful practitioners here in the community. David Ward is one of them that leads the intervention programs, working with people who have used violence in relationships. And he has taught this breathing technique. You breathe in for 4 counts, hold it for 2, you breathe out for 6 counts. I use this. I teach this to my law students. I do this with my own children. I'm like, we need to breathe, right? But thinking about how do you actually calm yourself and decrease the stress in a situation. And these are skills that we need to teach our students as they're growing up through the elementary, middle, high schools, and being able to respond to people as people. And, we have this desire that to reach people so much earlier, because by the time someone is seeking emergency shelter at Human Options or another agency, by the time that they're coming to a domestic violence law clinic, the abuse has usually gone on for quite a while, and there's pretty severe, both of somebody experiencing abuse and of someone utilizing violence, and thinking about what could we do so much earlier.
And more, it is a public health problem, and health agencies are beginning to take some responsibility. Kaiser has a person who is a domestic family violence specialist. She is an MD, and she works throughout the system. And we started a very wonderful partnership with Kaiser, Orange County, where we do what's called a soft referral. And if there's any indication, one of the indications is where the spouse insists on being in the examining room with the patient, and we don't allow that. So if there's any indication, the doctor or the nurse, whoever is at that moment primary, will ask a question. Do you think you could use some help at home with issues of anger? And if the person says, well, maybe, we don't hand them a card. What happens is the medical assistant or the nurse goes with the patient to make a phone call to the Human Options hotline. That's what we call the soft referral. And that appointment is made before she leaves the medical facility. And I can't emphasize how alone the victim feels. She's embarrassed, she's ashamed in front of her own family. She can't tell her mother or her sister, her best friend even. Classically, if told, a family member might say, well, you made your bed, now you have to lie in it. Mm-hmm. You know who you married. But now we have the system where we can give that person a hand, literally, and walk her into help. So don't be afraid if you care about somebody to ask the question. People think, well, it can't happen here because we're all affluent and well-dressed, or it can't happen here because we're old and we've been through a lot, but it can happen anywhere. It's 1 in 4 women, and you're always surprised when you hear about it. For seniors, the risk is greater when somebody has Alzheimer's and they begin to lose their personality and lose control of impulses, and you can feel a lot of anger, not because you've done anything wrong, but because the own horrible changes in their own mind are causing them great pain. And so a good, kind person can become violent. And then somebody who has been controlling all marriage can escalate as you get older and you have perhaps less social support, more economic problems. Don't be embarrassed. I say that now, it's easy to say. Know that many of us have a handout for you or for your family member. And the social services program at Laguna Woods, much to my surprise, has a specialist in domestic violence that comes, I think, it used to come a couple times a week and now is available virtually. We know now that it is not a sign that there's something horrible wrong with you. It's a sign that communication, trauma have all built together to cause physical or emotional or economic oppression. So it does have something to do with us, if only just that we become ambassadors in the community, talking about healthy relationships.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's what we want for everyone, to be safe in the world, in their home, in their relationships, and to think about that and all that we can do to create that. And there is so much help available, including during COVID.
I can talk about this forever, but I think we've covered the really important pieces. I am so impressed with the work of our community. Those of us that are in the domestic violence field have felt such support from Jane and the Family Violence Clinic, and working with the students has been amazing, because we used to do a lunch at the end of the year. And it was wonderful to see the students feel that feeling. I made a difference in somebody's life. Mm-hmm. And that ability to help, to offer something and that is really meaningful is a gift. We get a gift because we get to help. And so it was such fun having that lunch with the students. And I hope if they do it again, I want to come. Because
Well, and Vivian, you have been such an inspiration, from literally co-founding Human Options out of the trunk of your car. Remember these stories, and to all that you have built here and all the difference. And it is such a privilege to be able to journey with people, accompany them, help them advocate on behalf of survivors, and to be able to really see the way forward. And so people have been through some very hard, challenging things, and to think about being able to build that beautiful future forward, and all that we can do in terms of societal issues to be able to create that sustained societal change that we know is possible. Thank you so much.
Concerned Citizens planted the peace pole and did a beautiful ceremony on International Peace Day, September 21st. And during that time, I was thinking about how beautiful that message is, and how we as concerned citizens, both our organization and in our own personal lives, want to live peace and spread peace. And it does start at home. And if we can help any family or any kid at an age of, we used to do a program for little kids called Hands Are Not for Hitting. And we sang a little song about that. And my late husband and I actually did that at the kindergarten for several of our grandchildren. And though I don't sing, I did it there. Being part of making a difference is a gift.
It is.
And Jane and I have been fortunate to find the vocation and the people where we can really connect and make a difference. So if you have teenagers in your family, If you're the grandparent, talk to them about dating. What's it like? It's very different, obviously. And we've been shocked by some of the early sexual behavior of preteens. And we address that sometimes that's again part of the over pleasing. So if we can open up conversation, we can begin to make change. I feel like, are we coming to a stopping point? I would like to give the hotline number. This is the Human Options hotline number, 877-854-3594. You may think you'll never need it. You don't know anybody that this is happening to, but it's a good thing to have. 877-854-3594. It's 24-hour hotline service and lots of resources and just a person who will listen. Having that voice there. Sometimes a woman would call us at 2:00 in the morning because the person was asleep and she could talk privately. The busiest time before COVID was Monday morning when the perpetrator would leave for work and the victim would still be home and would make the call.
No, and we've been grateful for the chance to partner with you over the years. If anyone's wanting to reach out to the UCI Law Clinic, the number there is 949-824-7916. That's 949-824-7916. Before anybody takes legal action, it's so important to do careful safety planning. And so it's always a good thing to start with one of the domestic violence agencies.
Right, and the hotline worker can help with safety planning. It does make a difference. One of the stereotypes about battered women is, well, we're not going to try to help them because they just go back. Well, research shows it takes 7 efforts to actually reach the place where the help is truly available and she can go for it. And Human Options has done 4 long-term research projects, including 2 with UC Irvine School of Social Ecology. And each time we found that 1 year or more after leaving the shelter of safety and support, the person is violence-free, and that's huge. So together we're building a violence-free culture. We're building a new generation with attitudes that are peaceful and positive, and we're going forward. And Concerned Citizens is a model of community support and caring. So I'm glad to be able to talk about this important issue for our community.